snow still came down in soft white veils that muted the ruin and stilled the groans of the dying. Winterfell's outer yard smelled of burnt hair and wet iron, but beneath the stench the pine tar on the gatehouse loomed clean and old as a prayer. Jon stood until his breath was a ghost before him and the night birds quieted, listening to the old stones remember. He could almost hear the thud of hooves from earlier, his horse's scream, his own voice lancing through the snow-splintered air as Ramsay's archers loosed and the boy ran. Rickon's hair had been black as a raven's wing against the snow. The arrow had hissed like something alive. Jon remembered spurring until there was no more thought in him, just the space between his brother and the next breath and the next arrow. He'd lifted the boy, small and rigid with terror, not yet bleeding, across his saddle as another shaft cracked against his shield. The third he had felt, not seen, whipping his cloak and stitching the fur to his arm with a bite of iron. Then the thunder of hooves from the south and the storm of banners climbing the air like crows, a sudden bronze tide of the Vale taking the flanks, and Winterfell's long shadow swallowing the field. Ramsay Bolton's dogs had died howling in their chains, and Ramsay himself bled quietly in the kennel's straw with the snow turning pink and then clean again. Now, when the wordless relief had fallen away and left him sober, Jon stood in the godswood with damp hair and a split knuckle where his sword had scraped stone, and watched the heart tree drip crimson sap as if it wept for everything and everyone. The snow picked at his shoulders, melted there, and slid like water down the fur. He had no crown and wanted none. Winter had never cared for crowns. Rickon slept in the maester's chambers with a fever from shock and exhaustion. Sansa had watched at his side with a stillness Jon could not read until dawn, then sent for him. When he came, she was looking out at the snow through leaded glass, the candle half gone, sister's hands folded on the table before her like a prayer she had set down and forgotten. "He keeps waking and asking where father is," she said without turning, "and where mother went. He doesn't remember some days. Then he remembers too much." She touched the tabletop the way one touches a wound to see if it will hurt again. "He will need someone who can hold that grief and not break." Jon's mouth was dry. "He has you. He has us." Sansa turned then, tired but composed, hair braided thickly, a new shadow at the corners of her mouth. "But the North will look for something as much as someone. Winterfell needs a Stark lord. We have one." Jon took a slow breath, tasting the smoke in the air from the charred timbers of the stables. The taste turned to ash when he thought of the wall and what lay beyond it. "The North needs a sword as much as a lord. The dead are moving. They are stories to some of our banners," Sansa answered, and her mouth twisted as if that, of all things, was the cruelest part. "Morning comes, and men forget what night tells them. They will remember if you make them." She stepped closer. "But not as a king." Jon smiled without warmth. "I would sooner wear ice." "Then don't," Sansa said, and the lantern's flame threw a little gold into her hair. "Rickon is the Lord of Winterfell. Announce him. Place him in Mother's high seat with the wolf and direwolf above him, the Northmen around him, and the old words spoken. Let them see something they remember. Then go." "Go where?" He knew, but it steadied him to ask. "South," she said, "as far as you must. To the Riverlands to cut out the fry rot before it reaches our doorstep. To White Harbor to bring back grain and ships. To the Neck to bring the Crannogmen out of their mires, if they will come. They owe father that much. To Dragonstone." She stopped, watching the snow gather in the corners of the window. "I never understood father's letters when I was little," she added softly. "He wrote much of stone and duty. Always stone, always duty. We are there now. They will not follow a bastard south," Jon said, testing the words and finding in their weight a kind of relief. It let him feel small when everything else threatened to make him larger than he could stand. "They will follow the North's sword," Sansa replied, and when she said it the room seemed to remember itself. Thin winter glass, thick walls, a long, quiet lineage humming in the stone. "They will follow you because you set them something to hold, and because you do not take what isn't yours. Those two things together." She caught his gaze and held it. "Those two things, Jon, men will die for? He had no great answer. He only nodded, feeling the words seat themselves in the space where fear had been. They gathered the lords and the captains in the great hall at dusk. The banners were stained and patched, but they hung. The wolf's head had been restitched where knives had cut it. Sansa had seen to that. Flickers of firelight ran down the iron braziers and threw the shadows of spears up into the rafters like a forest of knights. Rickon stood on his own, his small hands clenched, and looked very much like a boy trying very hard not to be one. His hair was too long and fell in his eyes. Sansa smoothed it back and left her hand there a moment, steadying him without seeming to. Jon watched from a half-step behind, and Ghost sat silent and white at his left knee, the beast's eyes red coins in the smoke. Lyanna Mormont's voice cut the hall like a knife when the noise grew too fat with itself. "Here is your lord," she said. "If you have forgotten the face of your house, look up." The men and women of the north looked up. They always had. They saw the boy and the dire wolf and what remained of Eddard Stark in both, and the room breathed out as one breath does when pain fades for an instant. They knelt. Rickon's voice shook but held. "I will keep faith," he said. "I will remember. I will do what father would have done." Jon stepped forward then, went to a knee before him, and put his sword down flat and offered the hilt across his palms. "And I will hold the line," he said. "By your leave, my lord, I will ride south as your sword, to unstop the rivers, to bring back ships, to make every mile between our walls, and there's something that will bleed any who try us. I will bring dragonglass by the shipful if I can find it. I will bring back men who have seen the thing I have seen." Rickon swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. Sansa's hand fell away from his hair. The boy looked down at Jon for a long moment, and in that space Jon saw, not the child who had gone howling down Winterfell's halls after a wildcat, but a boy assembling pieces of his father's face behind his own. Rickon took a breath, and the air moved around him as if it too had been waiting. "Rise," he said, and his voice steadied. "Go." The room loosed itself into new currents. Wyman Manderly's bulk gleamed with sweat, his rings flashing as he nodded, already turning inward where the counting of ships lived. Robert Glover looked as if he had swallowed iron and found, to his surprise, that he could keep it down. Jon Royce's grim, weathered face relaxed a degree. A Vale Lord measuring Starks against airy stone and finding, reluctantly, that stone still knew stone. Even Lord Serwyn, thin as a starving tree, made a sound that could have been approval. It did not end without a reckoning. Davos Seaworth stood at the hall's edge, eyes gone black with something that had learned to be quiet and refused to be quiet any longer. When Jon nodded to him, the knight bowed his head once and then looked past him. The Red Woman waited in the shadows by the rear doors, the snow melting into her hair and vanishing, leaving it the color of freshly bled clay. When he called her forward, the room turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. "You know what I did?" Davos said tightly, and though the hall was full, the two men and the woman made an island within it. "You know whose child she was. You lit her like a candle on your god's altar." Melisandre's mouth was a still line. Her eyes did not flinch from Davos to Jon, but when she spoke, it was to Jon. "I brought you back," she said. "The night is long and full of tur." "She was Shireen," Davos said, and the name did the work words had not. He swallowed hard, then forced calm into his voice like a man holding a knife steady. "There is no road back from what you did, my lady." Jon looked between them and thought of Marya Seaworth's cracked hands, of the girl's shy smile in the snow outside Castle Black when the world had seemed to him a circle drawn in charcoal. He thought of the fire in the eyes of the Red Woman and the second birth she had given him, and the darkness beyond the wall that had stared back. Duty was never clean and mercy often cut. "You will ride south," he said at last, and Melisandre's eyes shifted, just slightly, as if she saw the turn of the blade inside him. "You will ride south and not return to Winterfell. If you do, I will hang you. If I hear you light another child, I will find you and gut you myself." Melisandre inclined her head as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "The North's sword," she murmured. and smiled the way one smiles at a prophecy that has begun to wake. "There is a queen in the south who will need to hear you. I have been to Dragonstone before. The stone remembers the fire like bone remembers a break." "Go," Jon said, and the red woman bowed and was gone, leaving only wet footprints that darkened and disappeared. They left at nightfall 2 days later, with the snow falling in a steady veil and the gate groaning like an old man's knee. Ghosts trotted silent in their shadows. Davos rode at Jon's right. His jaw bristled with gray and set, looking east as though the sea were a woman he had left without goodbye. Tormund Giantsbane rode a shaggy gray mare toward the back with a handful of free folk, laughing too loud in the cold and swearing that the south smelled like wet cheese and horse farts. The direwolf's eyes went red as coals when torches flared, then banked again when the wind took them. Sansa met Jon at the gate with Rickon at her side, Brienne looming behind like a stone that had taken a vow. The boy looked very small in his new cloak, the direwolf clasp bright and precise against fur. He lifted his chin and touched his fingers to Jon's wrist, a quick, bracing press. "Go," he said, simple as breathing, as if they were at supper and he had told a brother to pass bread. "Bring back sharp things." Sansa's hand tightened for an instant on Jon's sleeve, then let go. "Right," she said, "even if it's only 3 words. 2 if you must." Her mouth softened by a fraction. "No ghosts," she added. "You have one already?" Jon said, and Ghost flicked an ear, as if the joke were beneath him. They went out, and Winterfell stood behind them and watched until the snow swallowed them whole. Moat Cailin rose out of the fog like rotted teeth. The gray stone was slick with long years of rain that had forgotten to stop. The reeds lay down around the base of the watchtowers as if they had been told a story too often and wanted to sleep. Jon smelled peat and wet steel and the sourness of marsh. They made camp on a sparse hummock of ground where a few struggling trees had thrust their roots deep and refused to drown. The wind came in thin knives. At night, the mists crawled over the water like living things, and the calls of unknown birds rippled. 2 nights in, Tormund woke with frost in his beard and a spear point at his throat. "Easy," said a man's voice from the fog, and another figure resolved behind the first, short and slight and standing in water to the knees like a woman born to it. "You're far from your wall, crows. We left the feathers in the snow," Jon said, slowly raising his hands away from his sword. "We're heading south. The neck is not a place for strangers to pass without knocking." A third shape moved, and the reeds parted around a small boat that slid soundless to the hummock. The man who stepped from it was thin and wiry and looked younger than the gray in his hair allowed. His eyes were the green of river glass. He wore a leather jerkin painted with water, and frog's bone hung from the thong at his wrist. "You look like your father," he said. "He came this way in another winter. He left the south smaller than it had been." Jon felt something tilt inside him and find a new bed. "You knew my father." The man nodded. "I am Howland Reed," he said. "I hold Greywater Watch. I never hold it in the same place twice." The faintest smile touched his mouth, like a water ripple and gone. "The South forgets the swamps. It always has. This is sometimes useful." Tormund eyed him as one might a small, bright snake. "You're half of nothing," he said. "Where's your other half?" The woman on the other side of him grinned, showing small, sharp teeth. "In the reeds, where else?" They shared thin fish grilled over peat and a spirit that burned like a clear flame going down and sat under the bent trees. Howland Reed asked few questions and answered almost none. He watched Jon the way one watches the change of weather. "The dead are moving," Jon said finally, when the lies had all fallen away of their own weight. "I saw them. They took men I had known long enough to have tired of them and gave them back to me with nothing behind their eyes. They are coming through the woods and over the hills and across the rivers because nothing we have built can turn winter aside any longer. If the South thinks the neck will stop them, it lies to itself with open eyes." Howland's head tilted. The green in his gaze deepened, as if moss had taken a deeper hold. "You speak like a Stark," he said, "and like something else. Something else." Jon's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. He could feel Davos beside him, very still. "The wind is a blade that forgets it's a blade," Howland said, which was to say nothing human, and yet the air between them shifted. Then he reached into the pocket of his jerkin and drew out a small thing wrapped in oiled leather. "My wife gave me this the year your father asked me to ride south," he said. "She said it would keep my foot in the marsh and my head in the trees." His mouth curved again. "It did, after a fashion. I am very hard to kill. The spearwives say I am hard to find and harder still to be rid of. This, though..." He set the little bundle in Jon's hands and watched him unwrap it. Inside lay a ring of simple silver wire, old and thin, set with a white stone so small that it might have been a tear if tears could harden. "I took it from a bed of blood and milk," Howland said, voice gone far away, as if it were moving down a long corridor that had no doors. "I took it because no one else lived to carry it. I have kept it because your father asked me to keep a thing safe, and I was young and full of a young man's notions." Jon felt the world tilt again. The stone caught the firelight and held it like a fox holds a hen under its paw. He had never seen this ring, and yet his skin raised as if an old wind had blown over him, bringing a smell he'd known as a sleeping child and forgotten upon waking. It felt like home and like a grave. "What is it?" Davos asked softly. Howland Reed's eyes did not leave Jon's. "A promise," he said. "When you have need of it, you will know." It was the sort of speech that in other mouths would have sounded like the nonsense of an old man fat on the taste of mystery. In Howland's mouth it sounded like the simple rude truth of a man who lived in water and had learned that the land was the liar. Jon closed his fingers over the thing and felt the old metal warm in his palm. "The Freys have long fingers," Howland said then, as if that were the end of the matter for now. "They have been pricking this country like a dozen little knives for years. They are reaching for the neck. That is foolish." He looked at Tormund and grinned suddenly. It made him look young. "Let's make them more foolish." They passed through the moat with the reeds closing behind them like a wound knitting. The crannogmen melted ahead and to the sides, showing them where the land rose under the water if you knew where to press your heel and how to bend your weight. The free folk swore in voices like broken rocks and learned to move more lightly than they had been born to. Ghost trod the mud as if it had remembered he had once been a shadow in the snow. The riverlands wore hunger on its hard face. Villages had been sucked dry by tolls and raiding. Herricks stood flattened like old hats. The water level at fords had sunk as if the rivers were tired. When they crested the last low rise before the twins, they saw crows circling in a lazy gyre that said meat lay below. The towers rose as they always had, gray twin tusks thrust into a sky that had the color of old steel. Between them the bridge knifed the water. Fry banners hung damp and dull. Even from a distance Jon could feel the pettiness of a place grown fat on the act of saying no. "Ugly," Tormund concluded, spitting thoughtfully, "like a pox scar on a pretty girl." "They have 100 archers," Davos murmured, "and the bridge and murder in their hearts. We have armor and a handful of voices worth listening to. We cannot sit here and wait for winter to do the work, or the Lannisters to come sniffing. We also cannot throw men into a choke like rabbits into a snare. They are already dead," a new voice said, muffled and light, as if the speaker carried a smile under a mask. Jon turned. A girl stood beside a low thorn bush as if she had grown there, a traveling cloak too big for her draped carelessly, a dagger at her hip plain as a farmer's spoon. Her face was smudged with dirt and cold and something that did not care what either thought of it. When she pushed back her hood, her hair came down like dark rain. Her eyes were gray and sharp as the edge of an icicle. For a moment no one moved. Then Jon forgot how to breathe. "Cat," he said, stunned in a way no arrow or sword had stunned him. "Not anymore," Arya said, and now she did smile. Came and went like a knife flicker. She walked forward, and before anything else she reached up and touched the side of his face as if to confirm the bone and skin of him. "You look stupid," she informed him, "like father when he had to pretend for the king's sake." He caught her wrist in both hands, then gathered her into him with a sound he had not made since he was 12. She was hard and thin and real. Ghost's ears went forward and the direwolf sniffed her cloak and huffed, once, and stood taller, as if something of the house had clicked into place. "How?" Davos asked, recovering first because he had learned to live in the space between impossibilities. Arya shrugged. "Freys are easy if you make them forget you're a person," she said. "I made them look at their food. They like to do that. The old one died looking at a pie. Some of his sons died looking at wine. Some of them died looking at me." She tilted her head toward the towers. "Those ones up there died 2 nights ago. They don't know it yet. It takes time to carry a death down a family this rotten." "She's a savage," Tormund observed, openly admiring. "Can she be my queen? Your little queen in the north?" "She's my sister," Jon said, and it filled his mouth like honey and like blood. "You will not say that in jest again." He wiped at his face with the back of his glove and looked back at the towers. "If Walder Frey is dead, and his sons fall with him, who holds the bridge?" "Fear," Arya said simply. "And a boy who isn't old enough to be afraid of the right things. There are men in there waiting for a voice that won't come." "Then we give them one," Davos said, and for a moment his eyes looked less haunted. "With a letter for every river lord, every miller, every woman whose son was taken for a levy he never came back from. The North will hold the crossing for the realm until the Tully banner rises again. We set a new toll, grain to pass, grain to the north, cheap. We make the bridge a throat that feeds us." Jon nodded. "We do that," he said. "We hoist our wolf, and with it the trout for old time's sake. If any of them have a Tully left in them, they'll bleed in color again. That will call the Lannisters," Davos warned. "Let them come," Tormund growled, eager. "Let them march over their own dead to get here." "They are far," Jon said quietly, eyes on the towers. "Winter is near. Winter we can use." They took the twins with a whisper and a hand on the throat rather than a shout and a blade. The gates opened because men who had learned to take orders from a sodden old spider found that while the web lay in tatters, their legs still wished to move under the pulling of strings. Arya slipped through the kitchens as if she had written their map herself, and when the freckled boy who had called himself Steward put a hand on her arm, she looked at him until he remembered, suddenly and entirely, that he had been born a good boy and could remain one if he set his feet correctly upon the ground. A man named Norbert Frey, with softer hands than his voice and a badly healed break in his nose, ran out onto the bridge waving a rag white, though it had been dunked hurriedly in slop, and shouted, in a voice ragged with the shock of obedience's death, that he surrendered and that if they came close he would surrender louder. Tormund laughed like thunder rolling away. The free folk lifted hoots and thumps upon their shields. Jon rode onto the bridge slowly, with ghost padding, and looked up at the towers and wondered whether stone felt the change when a tarnished banner fell and another rose. They hung the dire wolf over the bridge and, at Arya's pointed, wry request, the trout beside it. Davos sent letters like seeds cast into a plowed field, some taking root at once, some never, some to sprout late in winter when that mattered more. Millers' wives came with sacks of barley, carters with hay bales, even fishermen with salt cod, thin as prayer scrolls and twice as dear, because a new law had been spoken in the space between 2 towers where the old law had rotted. Jon took toll in wheat flour and hard oats and sour apples, salted pork and dried beans, barrels of black ale, the stuff of walls that did not topple. White Harbor's factors came and signed with Manderley's seal for shipments to the north, their pens scratching as if clearing their throats after a long cough. At night, he walked the bridge and listened to the water run. In the dark, when the men slept, Arya moved beside him like something from a story about woods that talk and women who dance without feet. She spoke little, as if words had grown barbs. "Sansa?" she asked at last, a soft question that was a knife laid down. "Hard," Jon said. "Strong. She knows things I do not. She carries them like iron and like silk. You'll see." Arya nodded, her mouth a line that wanted to smile and did not. "And Bran, lost to the old gods and found by them again," Jon said, and the words felt both right and absurd as he heard them aloud. "I don't understand him. He looks at me as if I were a page in a book he read many times. He will come home, I think, or home will go to him. It's hard to say which with Bran." Arya breathed out, and the breath came back to her as fog, and she scowled at it, as if even her own body dared to contradict her. 3 days after they took the twins, a fat man in green and blue rode up with frost on his beard and rings like small suns. Wyman Manderly's standard preceded him. 2 leaping mermen, bright even in winter's dull light, and when the fat man dismounted, sweating and bowed, he did it with the grace of a dancer who has learned where to put the weight. "The Lord too ill to travel," he panted. "But his son sends goodwill and ships as promised, and grain, if you will send it, and salt if you will take it, and perhaps we can be of a mind about a price that makes you our friend and not our need." Davos stepped forward as if he had been carved there. "How many ships?" he asked mildly. "Enough to lift an army if the gods are kind and the winds less cruel than they have been of late," the man said, smiling the smile of a merchant who has been schooled by the greatest liar in White Harbor and come away still loving him. "The harbor is hungry for good silver and fair treatment. We have need of a stone richer than any coin," Jon said, and the merchant's smile faltered. "Obsidian," Jon added. "Dragonglass, as much as a man can break out of a mountain, and more. I need ships that can carry it." The merchant licked his lips. "You want dragonstone," he said, and looked as if he wished Uncle Wyman were present to tell him precisely how foolish, wise, or both this was. "I want what kills the dead," Jon said baldly, and the man seemed to feel, for an instant, the way the air went thin and sharp around those words. "We can get you a deck to stand on," he said at last. "From there, well, men have fallen into lusher graves than the narrow sea in winter." "We will leave the twins in good hands," Jon said. He looked at Arya then, and she met his gaze unblinking. "Can you carry the river like a knife, little sister?" She considered it and then nodded once. "I can be more than one pair of eyes," she said. "Men here like to talk to girls who never stop smiling and boys who never stop nodding. They give things to people they think don't matter. Give them to someone who does," Jon said, and drew her into a hard, awkward embrace that made the men who pretended not to watch adjust their stances. "Go north when you have to. Stay alive because I asked you to. Don't tell me what to do," Arya retorted, but she leaned her forehead against his jaw for a heartbeat before stepping back. "I will be home before you if only to laugh at your long face," she added, and was gone in the efficient way a knife disappears into a belt. They went to White Harbor through a countryside that began, in small, grudging ways, to look less starved. The river fog hung thick on some mornings, and Jon would wake swearing he had heard other men breathing who were not there. Once, he woke with the ring Howland Reed had given him clenched in his fist and did not remember closing his fingers around it in the night. It warmed under his skin the way a stone will if you keep it long enough. Wyman Manderly received them in a hall that smelled of salt and smoke and good bread. He was larger than Tails, and softer spoken than Jon had expected. "You look like him," Manderly said bluntly after the necessary words were said and the unnecessary ones measured. "Ned, you have the eyes." Jon had been told as much by men who loved his father and men who had watched him die, and the words landed in him the way a handful of dirt will if you are not yet in your grave. "I am not him," he said. "No," Manderly said calmly. "He would have made a worse sailor," Davos grunted, half a laugh kicking out of him in surprise. "He is not wrong." They loaded ships with sacks of rye and oat, salted meat, barrels of ale, sacks of onions that made even Davos smile, because for a man like him an onion was a small round prayer. They took on rope and wood and men whose eyes shone more than their swords, because winter makes rare the folk who can stand on a deck and not sicken when the world moves. They waited 3 days for a wind to come into the harbor that did not try to turn their sails inside out. When it came, they went. The sea in winter is a lesson you must learn in the sternest of schools. It broke over the bow and tried to pull the ship under with the slow remorselessness of an old grudge. Ghost disliked it immediately and retired to stand at the base of the mast like a god learning patience. Tormund took to the motion with a madman's pleasure, laughing as each wave shouldered him and he shouldered back. Davos wore the sea like clothing and woke each morning the way one wakes when there is someone you love in the room with you. They made dragonstone under a sky as gray as a blade that has dulled and been sharpened too often. The castle rose like the work of a mind that loved dragons, as a smith loves the first thing he made that did not break. The stone was black and slick. In the rain it looked like something alive. Jon smelled the old fire in it, as one smells a thing that happened in this place and leaves itself behind for those who have learned how to put their noses into the wind of time. The queen who held the castle now received him in a hall that led fire down the benches and up the carved ribs like a secret whispered many times. She was smaller than the stories said, and more beautiful than any practical use ought to allow. Her hair caught the light and threw it farther than seemed possible. Her eyes were blue in one flame and violet in another. He said to himself that they were eyes and not a thing from a song. "King in the north," said the girl beside the queen, lithe and careful and all weighed coin and clean page. "Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen invites you to bend the knee." Jon said, "I am the North Sword, not its king." And the words slid open a space in the room. "And the boy who sits Winterfell's chair bears a better name than mine. I bend the knee to him. I am here because the wall will not be a wall for long, and the dead do not bend the knee or ask leave." The man who stood a little behind the queen and leaned as if the stones were old friends lifted his brows, amused. "That will be Tyrion," Davos whispered out the corner of his mouth, not without fondness. "I once tried to steal from him. We are most of us better men for trying something and learning not." The queen's mouth curved. "Truth tastes strange to my counsel," she said. Her voice rode his bones easily. "You come to a stranger's hall to tell a tale and ask for a mountain to be broken, and tell me you will not honor me as your liege. It is a bold speech." "It is not a lie," Jon said. "A lie would be smoother." "What is it you want?" she asked. "Dragonglass," Jon said, "and a day without men in my way, then a month, then a winter. I want mines filling and ships carrying and swamp men to stop laughing at us long enough to come out of the water. I do not want your chair. If you mean to take it, that is your war. If you mean to live through a night that has no dawn in it, that is ours." The queen's hand moved. It was a small movement, but something in it suggested a woman who had learned to give men leave to live or die with a turn of the wrist. "You have seen them," she said, and for a moment unconsidered fear slid under what she was, like a thin black fish. "The dead." "I have," Jon said. "I killed a White Walker with a Valyrian blade, and it broke like frozen glass. I saw dead men rise and dead horses carry them as if flesh meant nothing, and the only thing I have held in my hands that felt like their end was the stone that came from fire a very long time ago." A man with a shaved head who held silence like a weapon breathed out softly. The girl beside the queen's mouth trembled and steadied. The queen looked at Jon and then passed him to some place he had not been and would not wish to go. When she spoke again, it was to ask, in a human voice, tired and raw, "Who told you to come to me with this?" "A woman the South calls a witch and the North calls a liar, and I call a set of hands that pulled me out of a black," Jon said. "She said the stone remembers fire, and the fire remembers stone. I didn't come because she bid me. I came because I have learned which lies feed men and which feed ghosts." Silence turned over the hall like a wave. Then Tyrion Lannister stepped forward with a dry smile and that air of complicity men wear when they have survived too many plans not to make more. "He is telling the truth," the little man said. "Whether he knows it all is another thing. I have seen him stubborn and honest in equal measure. It is an unexpected combination." "You have always loved combinations," the queen said, and for an instant fondness made her face almost childlike. She closed her eyes, opened them again, and they were a woman's eyes. "Take your stone," she said to Jon. "Take as much as you can break and ship and melt into 1,000 sharp things, and use them on the dead and not the living if you can help it. Show my people how you intend to fight this night. If you can show me, we will speak of the throne another day." Davos made a sound that might have been a prayer. Jon inclined his head. "Thank you," he said, and wondered when last he had said those two words and felt they mattered. They set men to the old pits. The sound of the first hammer blow went through Jon as if someone had struck his bones. The stone came away reluctantly at first, then more easily, as if it had decided it had slept long enough. Jon wrapped his hands until the knuckles looked like clumsy things and worked beside men who had known steel all their lives and men who had only known soil. And in each he saw the same slow astonishment as the black glass came free. The stuff had weight and a strange sheen, and when he held a shard up to the light pouring through a crack, he could see scarlet threads in it like cracks where old fire had tried and failed to get back out. A girl walked into the pit one day carrying a book, and a boy who wore the expression of someone who had been convinced against his better judgment to try something that would likely burn him. The girl read the word obsidian aloud as if tasting each letter for poison and finding instead a new spice she did not know how to use yet. The boy had strong arms and a gaze that went shy when it met Jon's. His hair was black and stuck up as if it had been named for some mischief. "He can work metal as if the stuff owed him a debt," Davos said afterward, grinning crookedly, as the boy lifted a newly cast spearhead as if he were lifting the world. "He's a bastard too, though he wears it more like a badge than a wound. His name is Gendry." Gendry's palms were calloused and imperfectly cleaned. He held the obsidian carefully, as one holds a wild thing that might cut you and might feed you and is not sure which it wants. "This is wrong to the hand," he said, which told Jon enough. "Not like iron, but if it wants to be a knife, I can make it one. If it wants to be a hammer, I can tell it no." "It wants to be both," Jon said. Gendry grinned then, quick and fierce. "So do I." They built a small new empire in the worm-riddled belly of an old one. Men carried stone to the forges and carried knives and spearheads away from them like people carrying lit coals that somehow did not burn. Shipwrights came with cunning eyes and tight jaws and quietly measured the weight of barrels and the patience of decks. Tyrion came at odd hours with questions that poked like a finger into a bruise and smiles that meant nothing and everything both. The girl with the braid like a column of night moved like a shadow, and when she spoke, it was to place everything in its right order with a gentleness that made men want to do it before she told them to. The queen watched from the parapet on some mornings, wrapped in a wool cloak too simple for the gold of her hair. Dragons cut the sky over the cliffs like knives that had learned to become birds. They did not come near the men unless called. When the youngest swerved suddenly and shrieked in delight at its own curved shadow, even Tormund ducked, muttering, and the free folk whispered old words from old hills where they had once told their children terrible stories for the pleasure of hearing them beg for more. One night, when the sea's voice rose and the wind moved the flames as if they were grass, a raven came to Jon with a leg stiff as a stick. The strip of parchment tied there smelled of resin and winter and something like damp stone. It was Bran's hand upon the writing and not his voice, and yet Jon heard him. The words were spare as bone. "Jon," it said, "and then you are your mother's son. You are your father's son. You are not who you have been told. Come home when you can. I will show you. The night is a wide mouth. Do not step into it unless you know the tongue that speaks in the dark." He held the paper until the edges softened under his fingers. In the morning he went down to the shore and watched the waves make and unmake themselves and tried to remember what it had felt like to be a boy in Winterfell running and not thinking of where he might end. He put his hand into his pocket and closed his fingers around the little ring Howland Reed had given him and felt it burn a little, like a stone that had been lying in the sun throw a lesson into a palm that deserved it. "I have to go north," he said to Davos, who nodded as if he had been expecting to hear that from the day he had met Jon. "I have to tell them what we're doing here. I have to show them it isn't a story. I have to—" He stopped, surprised by the word that had come. "I have to see my family." "Those are reasons enough," Davos said. "Leave men here with hands and eyes and sense. Leave a note here and there for the Lannisters with pretty handwriting. Take a ship heavy with sharp things and a mouth full of bad news and go." He told the queen they were going. She stood very still and looked out over the water and then turned and looked at him as if she were deciding whether he would make a better knife or spear. "You will come back," she said. "If you will have me," Jon said, "because the truth sits cleaner on the tongue if you let it keep its own shape." She watched him, something like amusement moving under her face like fish underwater. "You are not like them," she said at last. "The men who have asked me to help them win a game they have already lost. You do not ask me to sit beside you. You ask me to stand in a night with you. I don't know how to do anything else, Jon said. She smiled then, small and real. Good, she said. Go north, North's sword, and come back with something that will make my dragons a comfort rather than a legend. He left men with Gendry and with a scarred smith from the Vale who had learned to love obsidian like a stubborn wife. He left Tormund with the free folk, who did not love the sea but loved less the thought of being told later that someone else had faced the night while they were gutting fish. He left Davos notes for Manderley and for men whose names were old wood and river stones. He took a ship with a narrow waist and a deck that sloped a little just where the eye did not expect it, because the shipwright had said quietly that ships that risked the sea in winter needed a few secrets too. They made White Harbor under a sky that had briefly remembered blue. The docks shouted and swore and stank as docks do, blessedly alive. Girls with baskets of mussels moved like practical tide. Men hoisted barrels of black glass as if lifting a saint's bones and did not joke. They rode north with sledges heavy behind and sled horses that snorted steam and looked affronted. They came upon a ruined village with the snow in the doorways and the doors hung open and the hearthstones cold as old teeth. Ghost stood in the street and did not lift his nose. Jon went into a house with a cradle still hung with a carved bird A. Nd stood in the center of the room and listened. The silence had weight. He could hear the small sounds men make when they are trying not to make any sound at all and realized he was hearing his own breath. He did not tell the men what he understood there. He only said a watch different that night and watched the men's faces when they woke to a sky clean and a morning unremarkable and saw it meant nothing at all, which in itself meant everything. Men are more attentive when the obvious does not occur. Winterfell's walls rose at last out of light that had gone thinner and farther away. Jon felt his heart put one hand upon the stones before the rest of him had even reached the gate. The guards shouted. The gate opened. The snow came down in flakes big as a child's thumb. In the yard, the boy stood on the steps in his heavy cloak with the direwolf clasp, and two figures flanked him that had once been girls in blue and in green and were now too many other things. Bran's eyes had retreated far back into his head, not in fear, but in an attention so deep that it made everyone else's looks seem like scratches on skin. Sansa stood with her hands on the railing, knuckles white, face steady. Arya appeared as if she had never not been there, on the edge of the steps, and Ghost moved through the space between them like a prayer that had not been spoken aloud. Jon dismounted and put his hand on the stone step because he needed to feel it. He climbed, and the boy stepped forward with the courage of someone who had practiced all morning not to be afraid. Jon went to one knee without knowing he planned to and put his head down. "My lord," he said to Rickon's boots, "I have brought things that cut." Rickon's hand came down carefully upon his hair, as if he feared he might help or hurt too much with a touch. "Good," he said. Then the courtyard turned, and he was laughing and Sansa was crying and Arya had punched him in the shoulder in a way that would leave a bruise later, and Bran looked at him as if through him and said quietly, "You went where you had to go," and Jon believed him. In the hall, by the fire, Bran put the ring Howland Reed had given him on the table between them and looked at it as if it were a word he had read and had not been able to stop reading since. "I know what it is," he said. "I guessed," Jon said, and the word felt like a door pulled open. Bran's gaze did not waver. "Our Father," he began, and a hush moved through the room, because even the old timbers knew what that name meant. He kept a promise. He kept many. He broke a few to keep the one that mattered most. He went to a tower where a woman was dying and heard her ask him to keep a name in a chest and a chest in a river that no one could find. He brought a baby from a bed of blood and lay, later, on a stone that had let the sun too long and bled from the throat. He did what he could with the time he had. Jon looked at the ring and saw, as if across a winter street, a girl with blue roses in her hair and a laugh that had made a man ride south when he would rather have stayed in a narrow, decent life. He did not know why he saw that, and he did not ask. There are some things a man can carry into his bones without speech. "Your father is our uncle," Bran said softly. "Our mother is your mother, too, in a way. It does not matter for what I am going to say." What matters is that you are not what men think you are. You are more and less both, as all honest things are. Say it, Sansa whispered, eyes wet, voice iron. Rhaegar Targaryen married Lyanna Stark, Bran said. The name came out like a bell that would sound in men's heads long after they left the hall. The boy from the tower is the man at this table. The words on the paper in Old Town say it one way. The tree says it another. The truth is a braid of the two. Silence did what only silence could then. Arya sucked in a breath and let it out slowly, watching Jon as if he might make a wrong move and break and she would have to kill him out of mercy. Rickon had gone very still and looked as if he wished to bite something hard and bloody and then sleep for a week. Sansa's face ran through grief and anger and a strange, rueful relief, then set into a shape that was somehow all of those and none. Jon thought of snow and of heat so great it had made glass once, long ago, and of a woman who had never been his mother and always had, in the way one woman's hand can spare a boy's head and make him one of a family that ought not to have room for him and does anyway. He thought, too, of a queen with eyes like knives and a girl who had said bend, and of dragons cutting a sky and of a king who had sung instead of slaughtering and died in a river for it. He thought of duty like stone and truth like water. I am what the North needs me to be, he said finally, and found, with surprise, that this was not a lie. For now that is a sword. Let the rest be as the gods wish. Bran's gaze flickered. For an instant a great wind moved in the hall, though no door had opened. It might have been relief. They showed the lords the obsidian. Knives laid upon the table gleamed like night that had chipped. The heads of spears and the points of arrows made a small forest of black. Men reached for them and went quiet at the touch. A thing happens in a room when a new hope enters it. The flame seemed to hold steady. Men's hands grew careful. Put the Umber boy at last hearth with a store of these, Jon said. Give him a dozen good men whose eyes are better than their boasting. Alice Karstark at Carhold, too. Give her more than the men who watched her father's folly. Give her a chance to fix what he made wrong. If they hold the first line a day, the second will have time to learn their boots. They rode against you, Lord Glover objected, but without heat. They were pushed, Jon said, and made the old pain of it part of the shape of this new work. They did not push themselves. The dead do not care about oaths broken by fear. They will come for all of us. We do not teach the children to remember and then forget ourselves. Lyanna Mormont thumped her small fist on the table in rough agreement. Give me a cart full of knives and I will give you a line that bites back, she announced. I can do that much and probably more than that, and I am tired of watching the South talk and drink. We will need to talk and drink too before this is done, Davos said dryly, and if his eyes were damp, it was only the smoke. One keeps the mind from breaking and the other keeps the hands from shaking. But I, my lady, we can sharpen a knife. The days that followed were full as a war chest. Children were sent to basement rooms not as punishment but as promise. Women who had not seen the inside of the Great Hall except when passing to throw slops stood there with knives in hand and listened without flinching. Old men with careful steps and careful words were given small sharp blades and told they would stand by doors with 3 others and reeve the wrists of anything that reached. Hunters came in with eyes bright from the cold and fingers missing and showed boys how to lay the obsidian along an arrow shaft so that it would sing right when it flew. Brienne of Tarth took spears into the yard and made women who had never held more than a broom hold them until their hands forgot to mind the weight. Jon Royce drilled men in the keep yard with the evidence of a lifetime that armor is a lie if the arm inside it is untrue. Even Rickon found himself a task. He walked among the men with Ghost and spoke their names out loud and looked at their faces, as if to say he would remember them should he need to call them aloud again on some morning when the snow did not stop falling. Bran sat by the heart tree in a cloak that had more crow's wings than wolf's and watched the blood run in the carved channels the old god's face had worn in the bark. Often Sansa stood a little to one side, where she could see him and he could see her if he wanted, and she would watch the same blood and think of words like oath and mercy and not know, sometimes, which belonged to which. Arya moved through the halls like the rumor of a storm and the relief after. In some rooms she was taller than she had been when she left. In others, smaller. She watched Littlefinger watching her and then watched him watching Sansa and did not smile. When at last Sansa called a halt and put her brother's boy before it and laid out a skein of words that led unbroken from the Ares' cool air to the warm stench of the old man Frey's hall to the Vienna of a knife in the dark under a staircase and a promise in a frosty courtyard, she did it in such a way that no man could pretend confusion had misled him into treachery. Peter Baelish kneeled with an interesting lack of grace and made the faces of a man who could not think of the right words to say to a woman he had fattened with lies until at last she had bitten him for it. Arya did not smile when Sansa raised her hand, either, though later, in the quiet, she lay that hand between hers and watched her sister until sleep came and took the shaking from her muscles. "My lord," Sansa said to Rickon that night when the boy looked nauseous and proud and had scraped his knuckles throwing up into a bucket he refused to let anyone carry for him. "We are becoming what we must. I do not like it," he said, wiping his mouth, eyes too old by a year. "Neither do I," she said. She put a hand behind his head and pressed his forehead gently. "We do not have to like what keeps us living." In the weeks before Jon's return south, ravens went out in such number that the rookery emptied and filled again like a tide. Letters came back. Many were simple and punishing. "We will not," some said. "We will. We are tired. We are coming. We will fight if you fight. We will hide. We will pray. We will send nothing but a man with a good voice with which to sing at your graves." Sansa set them into piles and did sums without moving her lips. Rickon watched and grew more an inch. On the last morning before he left again, Jon walked the wall with Ghost and listened. The air had a different weight than the air at Dragonstone. It carried pine resin and smoke and the smell of men who had been sweating in fur too long. It carried, too, a whisper like a song sung very far away by a throat that had been dead a long time. He put the ring from Howland Reed on his finger and felt it chill and then warm. He did not know if he wore it for the truth or the lie. Sometimes they are the same thing at different times of day. "Bring her," Sansa said when he stood in his old chamber packing quietly. "If she is what your brother says and what your letter says and what the split stones say, bring her. Bring her dragons and her ships and her sharp face. We can argue later about chairs. The snow does not care whom it falls on." Jon smiled involuntarily. "You have grown cruel, my lady." "I have grown practical," Sansa said. "Father was good. I am not sure he was practical." "Father died because he was good," Jon said, and the words carried no accusation, only the stubborn truth he could not bend even for love. "Let us not die because we are practical and nothing else." She nodded. "A balance," she said. "We will make one. We are Starks. We always did." Rickon came running in then, as if he were still a boy and not a boy trying very hard to practice the way to hold a hall steady with a look. He skidded, stopped, and looked at Jon with eyes that were very like their father's after all the trouble of the day was done. "Take Ghost," he said, awkward. "Or don't." He swallowed. "I want you to come back. If you do not, I will have to make myself into something I do not know how to be." Jon laughed, helpless, fast and low. "You already are," he said, and ruffled Rickon's hair because someone had to. "You will do, little lord. I will do. We will do." He kissed Arya on the forehead and let her pretend to bite him. He told Bran to stop looking at people as if he were counting the years they had left and then watched, startled, as his brother laughed and laughed quietly like a boy standing under a summer rain. He put his forehead to Sansa's for a heartbeat and then stepped back before either of them had to breathe deeply and recalibrate a face. He put his hand on the stone by the door when he left the room, as he always did, because he had learned to love what had learned to bear him. South again, and the same roads and the same rivers looked different because they always do when you carry another errand in your pockets. The sea was calmer, though no kinder. The sky held a blue for half a day like a promise it could not keep and then forgot it had said anything. Dragonstone received him with fewer words and more work, which was as he preferred. "You came back," the queen said, and smiled as one does when a wager has been won and you had the grace not to pretend you hadn't made it. "I said I would," Jon said. "Yes," she replied, "and I wish to see what a man looks like when he has returned to a hall where everyone speaks your name and then walks away again." She tilted her head. I know now. What do I look like? He asked before he could decide not to. Like a sword in a scabbard you are tempted to keep because the craft is beautiful, she said. And know you must draw because the work is sharp. He had no answer to that. He gave her lists that were not poems and plans that made no great shape upon the eye but did upon the ground. He walked with her along the cliffs and pointed to places where men could fall and places where they could learn to stand, and told her, with only small shame, that he did not know how to make a dragon be where he needed it to be. She admitted, with only small pride, that sometimes they went where they wished, and she called that wisdom if the day had ended well, and arrogance if it had not. At night he slept briefly and badly and dreamed of a winter road that did not end. He woke with the taste of cold in his mouth and the ring warm on his finger and the sound of a boy's laughter far behind him like a bell rung at a former hour. They broke more glass than the mountains seemed to have at first. They bound it in leather and slid it into quivers. They piled it in barrels that smelled of fruit and in sacks that had once held flour and would one day again if the gods were kind and men nimble. Ships went out under a winter sky and returned with decks shining black. He set aside a portion for Manderley and a portion for a man named Tytos in the Vale who had the dumb, old-fashioned habit of working beyond his station because no one had told him not to. He watched the line of obsidian grow in Winterfell's roll of inventories until the numbers began, finally, to look like what the mind might use for comfort and not only for madness. On the morning the first true frost fell on Dragonstone and stayed until noon, Jon took the queen up to the parapet and stood with her looking north. The sea cut its constant furrows. The wind had a knife in it and no insult. They stood with their shoulders not quite touching, and he watched the breath leave her mouth and vanish in the air as if it had never left at all. The dragons passed overhead one by one, like a promise written in a language men had not remembered how to speak. And the queen closed her eyes and tilted her face up, and when she opened them again, the color there had shifted. "If we do this," she said, not looking at him, "and the dead are as you say, and the night is as long as the old women said to frighten us away from each other's beds, and the men said to damn the men who came for their seats, then when morning comes, if morning comes, there will be nothing in the chairs that men have been killing each other for so long. There will be only breath and food, and the sound of children shouting because there is bread." Jon breathed in, out, the cold bit at the back of his throat. "That would be a good morning," he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice shifted too. "It would." She glanced at him. "You will not take a crown afterward," she said, not a question. "No," he said. "Because you do not want one," she said. "Because the North will not need one," Jon said, and surprised himself again. "It will need a memory and a wall that is more than ice. It will need hands. Crowns forget hands." She turned, finally, and looked at him fully. "I have been many things that men wanted me to be," she said. "I am learning to be what is needed, whether the men want that or not. I think I like it." She smiled the small true smile again. "I will send ships north with you when you go. I will come when it is time. If my dragons must burn my enemies, let them be enemies worth burning." "They will be," Jon said quietly. "They will be dead." She laughed then, unexpectedly, and it sounded like a fire in a small good hearth. When the first snow fell that did not melt on Dragonstone's black shoulders, they loaded the ships again. Gendry shook Jon's hand with a smith's grip and told him to bring back more stone and people who were better at lifting it and less good at arguing about when and why. Tyrion pressed a parchment into his hand with figures upon it that would make Manderley's heart beat faster, and an older, more private sum in a corner that would earn a muttered word and a grateful grunt from Davos. The queen did not press anything into his hand. She stood looking up at a sky that had learned to be winter and said, "I have sent a bird to Old Town. I want words from the men who keep them if they are not bound to pretend they have none. If there is a book that speaks of a night like this one and how men lived through it, I will have it. If there is not, I will write one." "It will be a long book," Jon said. "Yes," she said, "it will." They went north with the decks crowded by a black that was not night but a way to meet it. The sails pulled and bellied. The white crest of the sea's laughter hissed and was gone. Winter waited with its old patience. When they came again under Winterfell's smoke, the the walls answered with more than echo. There was a line of boys with their hair cut roughly and their hands wrapped. And when the black barrels came off the ship carts, they shouted as children do when a thing is both heavy and new. One of the boys, John would later think it had been a Glover, though it hardly mattered now, lifted a knife too quickly and cut his thumb and did not cry, only sucked it, eyes on the blade as if this were a teacher he respected. The hall filled with voices faster than the fires could warm it. John laid maps down. Sansa laid rosters. Davos laid the facts of grain and fire and water upon the table with the calm of a man opening a chest to show his neighbors that there is enough. Bran moved his hand slowly over the table without touching it, as if he felt words where men saw only ink. Rickon stood with his shoulders down and his chin up and did not pretend to know what he did not, which was the first knowledge a lord must have. Arya came and went and came, and when she leaned over a map to show where a brook became a stream that could drown a man if he thought too well of himself, no one argued. Lyanna Mormont was given a corner of the table and a chair with a cushion that she had to be convinced to take so her feet would not swing like a child's. On the night a storm rose and threw itself against the walls as if insulted by them. The bell in the tower struck twice without anyone pulling the rope. Men looked up, then at one another. They found their knives without speaking. John stood and felt something in the air shift the way air does when a great bird goes by and you cannot see it. He put his hand on the hilt of Longclaw, and Longclaw did not object. He went out into the yard. The snow swirled like a handful of feathers thrown high and laughed at by the wind. Ghost stood, ears forward, head low, and growled very softly. At the edge of the torchlight the snow seemed wrong, not falling the way a good snow falls, but moving, as if tired of falling and ready now to walk. Bran sat beneath the heart tree far off and looked this way, though there was no line of sight between them, and John felt the attention like a hand placed carefully upon his shoulder. The dead had always belonged to Winter. It was only lately men had begun to realize that Winter wished to claim the living too. He raised his hand. The men on the catwalk lifted their spears. He could feel the knives under the cloaks of women behind the doorways, and the soft, intent breathing of boys who had moved into spaces that would have seemed to them rooms for giants a season ago. He stood with his weight balanced and his breath slow, and he waited, and the storm laughed and tested the stone, and then withdrew a fraction, as if impressed, and in that small mercy he felt an old kindred. "This is home," he said to the night, and it was neither a boast nor a threat, but the classifying speech of a man putting things where they belong. "You may try to take it. You will not like the taste." The wind came then, and the snow lifted, and the dark beyond the torches moved and settled. There would be nights that took more than they left. There would be mornings when the bread was harder than the men who ate it and the water thickened to ice in the pail before you reached the door. There would be roads south again and words to say to queens and numbers to give to fat lords and men to convince that their dead could be made to stay dead, if only they did this or that with enough care. For now, there was only the breath of men in winter, and the weight of a sword at a man's side, and the knowledge that something had begun which would end with truth, or with nothing. John looked up. Snow landed on his lashes and did not melt at once. He thought of a woman with hair bright as coin and a boy with hair black as winter crow and a ring with a small white stone, and of a story the North had always told itself about itself when the night fell early and the candle burned not to see but to remind the rooms we were in of how to be rooms. He thought of the words Sansa had spoken to him and the words he had spoken to her and the look in Arya's eyes when she had stopped herself from smiling because the smile would be the thing that killed the man across from her someday if she let it out too early. He thought of Arthur and of the small, flinching quiet that had lived in him for months after the knife slid, and of how another sort of quiet had come to live there now. He put his hand to his chest, where the second birth had left its tight new skin, and to his finger, where Howland's ring lay, and to the pommel of Longclaw, where the white wolf's head felt cool and absurdly alive. He looked at the boy who was his lord, standing still in the doorway with his hands fisted and his jaw set, and at the girl who was danger and home in one glance, and at the sister who had learned to hold stone and silk at once and to keep both from slipping. This is what a North has, he thought. This is what a North is. Not a chair, not a song, a collection of edges and a patience that will hold them. The storm drew breath and blew. Winterfell leaned a little and then stood up straighter, like a man remembering an old discipline in his back. Jon smiled, a small thing a man might do when he has found the correct weight for his sword and the correct angle for his feet. When morning came, it would be a morning in winter, and they would work. When night came, it would be a night with the dead in it, and they would fight. They had knives that had once been mountain and fire, and hands that remembered dirt and blood and bread. They had a boy who would be a lord the way stone becomes stone by bearing snow. They had a woman who could read men's hearts and bind their worst instincts to their better, and a girl who could vanish and return with an answer where the question had only just been born, and a boy who could see the long rope of years and tug it gently here and there so it would throw the right knot. They had, as well, a sword. He stood in the yard, quiet as a tree in winter that had not forgotten how to green, and he listened to the wind, and the wind told him nothing he did not already know. He took that nothing into his lungs and let it out, and when he did, a wolf beside him did too. Then the day began, and so did the rest of it.